the sun god Ra. And in Hinduism, certain gods were associated with bees. You can see in some art, like Krishna often is pictured with a blue bee on his forehead. And in fact, certain Hindu gods were referred to as those who were nectar-born. And in Western Europe, for a long time, it was just sort of expected that families would keep their own hives. Honey was how you made mead. Honey was your sweetener. Farmers needed the bees to do their work for their crops. And people felt an attachment to the bees. There was some question even whether the bees were somehow connected to the heavens and connected in some spiritual way. And so it was just tradition that when a member of a family died, you were to go out to the hives and tell the bees. And this was such a common practice that from the Renaissance on, you'll find this depicted in many pieces of art. People believed that if you did not go notify the bees, that the hive would sicken and die, or that the bees would all leave the hive and go somewhere else. And people would often put black crepe around the hives. As happens anywhere with superstitions, you have different understandings about the specific details of how you do this. Kind of like right now, does anyone do the rabbit thing? I know that we're not the only. Really? We're the only ones here? Okay, someone's fessing up. So there's a tradition that a lot of people do on the first of the month where you say rabbit, and that helps ensure that you have a good month. But there's much debate. Do you say white rabbit, or rabbit? And so in the same way, in Western Europe, there would be some people who felt that it was very important that you go over with a stick and rap 3 times on the hives. Others who felt that it was important that you do it via song or in a rhyming verse. And if there was someone if it was the beekeeper who had died, and there was another person slated to take that slot, you would introduce them to the hive. This is the new beekeeper. When I first read about this, it just kind of grabbed me. And I think part of that was this whole thing where these families were seeing bees not just as something that provided honey for them, but they felt that there was some sort of a relationship there. Our Seventh Unitarian Universalist principle talks about our respect for the interdependent web of existence, of which we are just one part. And this was kind of like taking that another step. People felt that the bees, in some way, were actually part of the family. And so they all breathed together. Now, beekeeping in recent years has had a bit of a resurgence as some of us look to figure out how we're going to live the dream of the 1890s. But I still feel pretty comfortable assuming that the majority of us do not actually have our own hive that we are taking care of. But I think that we should still look at this tradition, examine it, and figure out if there is something in this that would be useful to us, and if we can adapt it to our own circumstances in some way. Last fall, we talked about grief practices. This was around the time of Dia de los Muertos. And one of the things that is very clear when you look at grief practices in other religions and in other cultures is that, for the most part, American culture, white influenced, Protestant influenced white culture just really does not do a good job at grief. If you were to say that we had one communal practice, it would probably be that you take however much time, bereavement time they call it, you are allowed at work, And most jobs have it very specific. You get 5 days for this kind of relative and 3 days for this kind of relative. We take our bereavement time, we go to the funeral, and then we get back to regular life, trying to pretend that nothing has changed. And if someone catches you weeping at your desk or in the middle of the frozen food aisle at H-E-B, what do? Shame. We feel embarrassed and we apologize, right? I'm sure I'm not the only person who has ever apologized for my own grieving. Like, that's not normal. That's not natural, especially when we compare it to other ways that people have to grieve, such as the Catholic grandmother who every week goes to Mass and lights a candle and says a prayer for the soul of her departed husband. Or the Confucian family who keeps an altar in their home honoring their ancestors and their departed loved ones. Or those who are practicing Jews who every year on the anniversary of their loved one's death, they light what's called a yahrzeit candle and they let it completely burn until it's burned itself out. I think Judaism is one of the practices that we should look more at, not to take their traditions, but to see the wisdom in them and come up with our own. If you are Jewish and you lose what is called a cardinal relative, so a parent or a child, then multiple times a year you will sit with others who have also lost that type of a relative, and you will say communal prayers. And this happens multiple times a year, and it happens for the rest of your life. Once you have lost a parent, you are now part of that group that will say these prayers. And frankly, I think that that is connected more to reality. I had a brother who died 40 years ago, and I know that my mother is very happy, has had a good life, but I know that to the very last day of her life, there's going to be part of her grieving her son. My dad died a couple of years ago, and I know that there is never going to come a day when I don't miss him. So how do we make friends with grief? And how do we come up with sort of ordinary practices that speak to us and make sense to us? I asked some of my friends about this, and one of the things that we all kind of agree on is that grief is just a part of life. And the longer you live, and the more you love, the more grief you're going to have. Grief is the tax that we pay on living and loving. But the thing is, it's worth it. I have a friend who financially, a few years ago, had a really, really good year. And then it was tax time. And he had quite a bit to say about that huge check that he had to write. But he did have the grace and the perspective to say, okay, yeah, but like I wouldn't have to write this huge check if I hadn't made all of this money. I mean, I did get to keep, a little bit more money than I'm having to give away. Grief is the tax that we pay, but all of that living, all of those experiences that we have, and all of that love is worth it. And it may not always feel like that. I'm sure that my friend, when he was actually having to write the check to send to the IRS, it may have been a little bit hard to keep his perspective. And when we are in the throes of grief, when it is fresh and raw and heartbreaking, it is understandable to not be able to just put this into some calm perspective and to even wonder if it is worth it to continue loving animals, pets, other humans. But grief has a way of softening. And one of the ways that we can help it soften is by coming up with ordinary ways to check in with our grief. In our culture, we often treat grief as if it is something that we are supposed to keep special, right? Only for special, sad events, rather than acknowledging that grief is part of life. And it's just something that we carry with us. And grief can walk hand in hand with gratitude. Some of my friends that I asked about grief, I asked them if they had particular practices where they actually were making it sort of a spiritual practice. I had one friend who talked about how her mother loved daffodils. And so now every year she just plants a ton of daffodil bulbs and thinks of her mom then. And then in the spring when they come up, she's thinking again about her mother. I have another friend, Joanna, and her brother he was one of these people that donated blood like on a regular basis, as often as they allow you to do. And when he died, she picked up the practice. And now she goes on a regular basis and donates blood and thinks about her brother when she does so. This is an actual photo that he sent me. I had a friend whose wife keeps this lamp on all the time. It was her mother's. And as she told him, she's just making sure that her mother's spirit has a light to lead her home. My friend Patrick, several years ago, was out shopping with his mother, and he found a mug, and they gave it to his grandmother. His grandmother would drink from it every morning. His grandmother died, and his mother got the mug. And he said that he never asked her about it, but he was pretty sure that when she drank from that mug, she was thinking of her mother. And then his mother died, and the mug has now come to him. And he says that every morning he is drinking his coffee out of that mug and thinking both of his grandmother and his mother. So how can you touch in with grief? How can you make grief a sort of ordinary, everyday practice? I thought about it in terms of my father. What would my version be of going and telling the bees? My dad was not a beekeeper. I wouldn't even know where to go to find a beehive. But my dad did like to get out in the natural world. He was a fisherman, but I'm pretty sure the fish, if I went and gave them the news, they're just going to feel a little bit, safer that he's not around to be of danger to them. And then I remembered. See, he used to live in New Mexico, out in the desert. And he had this little kind of like postage-size little yard, I guess you could call it that, with a fence. And every year, there's these things called spoon-billed thrashers. And there was a cactus in the corner of his fence. And they would come and build a nest every year, lay their eggs, have their little baby thrashers, and he enjoyed seeing them building the nest and listening to them sing, watching them fuss at other birds. Now, occasionally he would look out into his little yard and there would be a bull snake. Somehow a bull snake would get in under the fence and it would start heading towards the nest. Now, you don't actually want to kill bull snakes because they eat rattlers, and bull snakes themselves are not poisonous. So you would go out to the garage and get like a hoe or something and carefully get it under the snake and carry the snake far, far out into the desert and come back. He was kind of protecting the thrashers. So I realized, that's who I would go and tell the news. The thrashers and even the bull snake. I don't feel a need to actually make a pilgrimage to New Mexico. His house has long been sold to strangers. But I do like to get out in nature. And so my plan is I'm going to go out, probably Brushy Creek Park, go out near the water, and I'm going to look for some birds. And I'm going to tell the birds. I'm going to give them the message that my father is no longer here. And ask them to pass it along to other birds and other birds until it makes its way to New Mexico. I'm not planning on notifying any snakes. If I see any, I will be sure to give them the news too, very loudly, over my shoulder as I run in the opposite direction. Grief is just the tax that we pay on living and loving. It's ordinary. It's not something to be put back for a special occasion. How can you make grief just one of your spiritual practices? How are you going to tell the bees?